at least $10,000, perhaps 15.
So there must be something else that's making that line item go up.
And we will try to get some more information together for you and go over the departmental budgets.
The street trees is what made it go up this year.
Okay.
Yes, it's $14,000 alone just for the street trees, which were removed from last year's budget at staff's request. Because again, there was some open positions and, but those are coming back this year, so that bumps that number. Thankfully, and I had it right in front of me.
So it's not an upward trend, it's kind of like a one-year bump.
It's a reset. Yeah.
Right, it's reset.
But I'll still put together the trend on that for you. Page 17, then, again, we realize that the capital project fund presents some additional challenges this year, so we did put together a 2-page overview of comparative information between 2019 and 2020 budgets for what we look at is 2 different components to the capital, the pre-programmed area, things that we do pretty much every year to sustain certain programs and certain efforts. And then the on page 18 is the other capital costs. Those are much more year-to-year discretionary based items. So, and again, the comparison between 19 and 20, just for context.
This is not just, it's restoring to the baseline and then it's adding, correct? For some of them, like police vehicle replacement. So the budget last year was 51.5, baseline was 100. We're asking this year for 125. So you're going above the baseline.
The grouping that I look at is that total of the 435 between those, that pre-programmed group. And you're right, there will be some shuffling between some of those segments, particularly as we try to manage the replacement of the police vehicles and DPW vehicles and equipment. You know, there are some years where the police demands may be a little bit higher, public works may be higher. We try to
Is that because?
lace those things together.
So in the police in particular, so last year we deferred it, instead of just deferring for a year and carrying on, are you doubling up now for the 2020? Because
No, that's
so it's
just,
75,000 of something new.
it's about 2 squads a year, and this year's budget request came in at 125 for the 2 vehicles that need to be replaced.
And so that's higher than baseline.
Yes, it is.
Must be cars are going up.
I would, and I've always used these baselines as just benchmarks, but you're absolutely right, is that over time, I mean, a long-range plan indexes these a couple % every year. My baseline should probably be refreshed to reflect some of those new cost trends as well, but because we've been quoting that baseline for several years, I want it to be consistent, but yes. And then again, the other capital costs, which are much more year to year, they will vary widely depending on what's going on in our facilities, our community, village board initiatives, many factors. And then, well, we do have a lot of large infrastructure projects. Those are funded through bonded revenues. So from a annual impact, that is not seen in the capital budget because project costs are offset by bond revenues. But the long-term impact of that does start showing up in the debt service component of the budget as those expenditures and the costs for that get layered on top of our existing schedules.
Is there anything in there for implementation of parking and transportation, like buying parking meter? I don't know what it would be, but we were gonna put a placeholder.
Yes, there'll be something in the capital budget for that.
Is it debt financed, or would
No.
that be, so it'll show up in this part, right?
That particular item, we have budgeted for out of reserve since it is contingent and we don't really have a plan. We felt that reserves was a reasonable place to,
How much?
40,000.
What are you talking about? I didn't hear the question.
Oh, so we had talked about implementation of our parking and transportation plan, like if you, say
Okay.
you did meters, just the example that comes to mind. And
I
asked-
know, I just need to know
Oh,
what the
okay.
question was.
So he said that they didn't budget it, they just are gonna, they would take it out of reserve.
No, it's budgeted to come out of reserves. It's in the budget. And
Oh,
again,
it's
this is an
spent.
overview, the
Okay.
details we'll get into when we get to
So
the
this
capital
is,
budget
this
next
is,
week.
this is not reserves, this is just
This is tax or
levy,
state.
the 2020 levy to go
Yes.
towards this. But we also are budgeting reserves towards this.
There's reserves in a number of areas in the capital budget, either from,
How much is
So
in
how do you
reserves?
decide what is funded with
Right.
reserves and what is funded with levy?
And how much is there?
well, let's, if you don't mind, let's defer that until we get to the capital budget when we have all that information in front of
Is it
us.
to be capital?
No,
today
this
was the
is an
budget
overview.
But just so you know, when you, and I'm sure you're used to this in years past, but, so it's laid out, so you'll see exactly where it's pulling from. So there's a column for budgeted reserves, so it'll be clearly identifiable, and then we can definitely have a discussion based upon item and.
The reason I ask is I thought there was only 40,000 in there, and we were asking for more, staff was gonna ask for more capital reserves this year from revenue. Am I the one that heard that? Is there, do we only have 40,000 in reserves? I know you've been watching it like a hawk.
Well, the end
Seriously, my ears.
the end outcome of this year's proposed budget takes capital reserves down to under $5,000.
With the things you're proposing, but what
With
is
the
in there
thing.
right now?
Again, that's a topic
I thought-
for the
okay.
capital budget discussion next
You
week.
can't answer it even though you know the answer.
The budget's,
Okay.
I just don't have it memorized, I'm sorry, I don't wanna give you
Well, I mean, it's only
misinformation.
7 o'clock and we're almost done, so, I mean,
Mhm.
I don't know if we're, we have time allocated to talk about the capital budget next week or the week after.
And again, all those materials are in the budget package that are on the trustee podiums.
Hey, Mark, can you give me a little more color on major facility maintenance improvements, which jumps from 10 to 145?
Other than saying there's a number of items in the capital budget, what do we got? Danny, we have fire alarm systems, we have LED lighting enhancements,
24,000 in LED lighting enhancements in the village center, 7,000 LED lighting enhancements here.
We'll get to that in
40,000.
the capital budget, right?
yes.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I can wait.
But I can.
Fine, wait, you have to wait.
I can tell you.
Yeah, you guys know the details by heart, but somebody should have told me.
We've been doing our best to get this organized. So we've gone through it several times. So page 19 then on the budget metrics overview is, again, loops together on the utility side. At the end of the day, probably spend the most time talking about the strategy of increasing sewer utility rates by 20% in order to pay for some self-funding of the bond reserves that we expect to be coming up with the Southeast project, as well as some other infrastructure projects and equipment replacement over the next several years. We did move into that category 3 years ago. We started self-funding our sewer lining and manhole rehab efforts, as well as other equipment purchases. That's largely made possible due to the fact that when we set the rates for the sewer utility in 2014, which is the last time there was an increase of rates in the sewer utility, those rates were set in anticipation that the Southeast project would have been well underway at this point. A lot of reasons why that project had to simmer a little bit. And at the end of the day, I think it's fiscally gonna be while it's still significant, I think we were talking numbers in the $50 million range back then. Now we're in the $20 million range to accomplish hopefully very close to the same things. And those reserve funds, that was the first step in the process. Again, it's a very similar process over a much longer time frame. Has allowed the sewer utility to accumulate enough cash reserves to self-fund some of those smaller projects.
Like manholes?
Like manholes, sewer lining. Back in 2010, the general fund was loaning the sewer utility money to cover costs. So, again, in 9 years, we've gone away from that, being able to self-fund some of our smaller annual recurring projects, and that's a good thing. I would never propose to self-fund a $20 million project, but the smaller.
But by doing that, we have not saved the 1.5 million we need to bond for the sewer system, correct? The reserve, that's why we're raising rates 20% next year?
Well, that's, now that we've got a little more definitive of a plan to implement, that is one of the options for the first step to do that. And again, we'll hash through the options during the utility discussion.
So my only question was, if we thought that the sewer was gonna be earlier, like before now, the second part, and would we have funded all those smaller self-funded projects through it, knowing we would have had to come up with that bonding reserve so quickly? Were we ever thinking of saving it for that purpose?
Well, from a financial planning perspective, the metrics on that sewer project changed 3 months ago at the direction of the board to really accelerate that. So
Okay, cheaper than we planned before.
in 2014, again, it was a much more longer term look at it, but the unintended side effect of that is, again, the utility's in a positive financial position. They can issue revenue bonds now because they got proper coverage with debt service. And those reserves, which are needed to get that debt service coverage, allows us to self-fund some of our smaller projects. So the intent was not to try to save up for this scale of bond reserves back in 2014, but it was part of a multi-step ramp up to, again, trying to smooth the impact of the long-term implementation of that Southeast program as it was envisioned in 2014. And now we've got a new metric to start evaluating how we want to manage that.
Thank you for that. Are there any, it's only 7:07, 7:08. Are there any other questions people have?
Wait, questions.
Well, I did have one more section to the materials provided to you in the
Oh, you
packet.
did? I thought that was it.
And that was to actually go through the 2020 budget challenges memo that came out in the first and second quarter. Really didn't get much of an opportunity to discuss that. I know you probably read it already, but as we parallel into the 2020 budget cycle, again, it's page 20 in your materials for the Budget and Finance Committee.
Okay, I think, Mr. Davidian had a question. Did you?
Oh, I've got a bunch of them, but the one that came to mind was, do you mind?
No,
Is this improper?
No, I recognize you.
If there's money that's not spent, I think somebody said there's $40,000 given to the forestry, for forestry. Who,
Reserves.
do you have to spend money that's not spent for the reason that it's budgeted, or,
You mean the vacancy factor that we were talking about?
yeah, why is that
That's-
suddenly free money, I wonder?
Well, what we did was we reduced the budget because we, basically by managing vacant positions, so we basically said to the departments, you need to manage your vacant positions and keep them vacant longer in order so that we could do a budget reduction. So that's what we did last year.
Potentially keeping it longer, as long if they didn't have a lot of vacancy. If it was natural
Whatever,
vacancy,
if you only had one vacancy, maybe it would have to stay longer. If you had two, maybe it would only be fewer months. But, so that was a reduction we made last year, and we made essentially a 12-month reduction, and then this year we're saying we're gonna go to only a 6-month reduction, so that was an add to the
I
budget.
think the comment that made it interesting was, use it wherever you want it.
Right, but it was a cut, it wasn't like 40,000 in a
It was a-
give,
it was a cost
40,000 in a
reduction.
takeaway.
And now, I had a question about that too, and I missed it, I apologize, I came late, but, so the vacancy rate I see went back up. we achieved it last year, correct?
We had set, so one of the things that we discussed is that at the time, we were in budget, there were several vacant DPW positions. And we were also going through the process of, evaluating how to proceed with those. So based upon the direction that the board provided, we managed that accordingly.
Yeah, I remember your memo going out
So-
saying home vacant.
Yeah, so now, those positions are fully, we have staff in all of those positions.
In all general government, because it's not just DPW, right, it's general government.
Right, for purposes last year, it was allocated specifically to forestry, because at the time, that's what had made most sense, and there wasn't specific direction on which department to put it within.
Okay,
So that's what, just kind of one of the things I was sharing. We've been fully staffed now in DPW for the last several months.
and for the police, it was the other vacancy factor, and what happened to that for this 2020 year, you're proposing, staff proposing?
So in there, they have gone back to the 6-month, vacancy factor.
And that's what it was last year.
Correct, which has been developed based upon trend analysis that Mark tracks actually annually to make sure that there's always, you wanna plan for where you think you're gonna come out as a median.
Yeah, and again, all recruitment processes take longer than I think a lot of people would like, but the police department obviously
Does
is
the-
even more extensive. So it really only takes one person, one turnover to achieve that 6 months in the police department.
I understand. Does the board still have the authority to approve open positions or not, like, to fill them? Or has that been taken away?
And we still approve.
still
Right,
have
we
to
still
approve
approve
it.
them, we haven't changed that, right? Okay, so the option for the board, if that passes in the budget, is to not fill a position and manage it themselves, correct? Like, if we wanted to save money and keep it open for a longer period of time.